Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this evening I am lucky enough to be joined again. I think it's my first repeat interviewee, Professor Michael Quinlan. Professor Quinlan, thank you so much for joining me on this evening.
Thanks for the invitation, Tom, and I wasn't aware that I was in such a privileged position to be invited back as the first person to be invited back.
I had such an interesting chat with you the first time. I knew at that point in time there had to be a follow-up. There's the lawyer bond. It was all happening, so I just thought we had to do it again. So much to talk about. You're still in Sydney?
I'm still in Sydney, still working from home, delivering client, which has actually been quite good, but very different experience. And rarely get out of my bedroom. So
right. So can you give the listeners,
in case anyone's wondering?
Right. I was going to say, can you give the visitors a bit of a quick snapshot / update on what it looks like on the ground from Sydney in this COVID world?
Yeah, well, as I said, I've been working from home most of the time. I actually went into Parliament House for a meeting yesterday in town. So about the fourth time I've caught the train into town from Strathfield, where I live, since the great lockdown began. And not too many people on the train, a lot more people wearing masks. We're back alive in church now, which is good. People are encouraged to wear masks and discouraged from singing, and we have maximum number of people in any church, which I think is 50 people in Sydney at the moment. But life's sort of back to normal. Some of my family members have been working in the office the whole time, so for them it's sort of life as usual in a way. But for everyone else, it's a very different kind of life.
Yeah, it sounds like we're somewhat more fortunate up in Queensland, as you can probably tell, because we're stealing all the football. The AFL, the NRL, it's all moving up to sunny Queensland. But I think what's more confusing to Queenslanders is this odd contradiction that we're sort of observing. Don't necessarily want to call it a contradiction, even though I think that's the word that springs to everybody's mind when we're operating, it seems to be at a lot more a freer level than yourselves. So a lot of people seem to be able to work from their place of work, a lot of people out in the street. But then if you go watch your little brother's football game on the weekend, everybody's social distancing, and then all the boys run out onto the park and they tackle and they play good football, and then they come off in 1.5 meters, and everybody's sort of scratching their head going, what is going on? Can't put my finger on it, but it's confusing.
It certainly is. It's a bizarre period of history, but hopefully this period of history will come to an end at some point.
Yeah, let's pray for it. And I still greatly enjoy the name that you've given it, the Great Lockdown. I think I had a bit of a laugh about that last time, and I think that's terrific. Straight out of a Charles Dickens book. I think somebody's going to coin that one day, and just make sure you're there to claim it.
Oh, I don't think I invented it, but I've certainly adopted it.
Terrific. And how's the university?
The university's going well. We're, as I said, almost all the classes in the law school are online. We've got face-to-face classes for advocacy and alternative dispute resolution, because they're much more hands-on. But students seem to have adapted to it and to be enjoying the opportunity not to travel for a couple of hours to and from campus and things like that. Yeah. So it's there's positives and negatives in every aspect of life.
And are you noticing that the non-face-to-face aspect has that had a real impact on the learning component?
I don't think so. I'm delivering synchronous classes this semester, and it's really not all that different to being in class. In fact, some students are more comfortable asking questions because they can ask questions and by sending you a message, typing a message rather than actually speaking. So some students actually find it easier to ask you questions when you're giving a class online. So different for different people. I mean, I think if I was learning online, it requires you to be a lot more self-reliant and a lot more self-motivated. So some students, I'm sure, will be finding that a challenge, but others are thriving under the environment that we're in.
Well, that's good, because it doesn't seem like we have much of a choice, at least for the foreseeable future. So who would have thunk it? I still laugh to myself, you know, back at January 1st or New Year's Eve, sitting there, I can tell you exactly what I was doing, and I can tell you exactly what was going through my mind and the map I had for what my 2020 was going to look like. And I won't tell you what happened after then. After that, it's you wake up every day and you go, can it get worse? It actually can. So it's quite funny, I find.
Yep, it's very strange.
All right, well, let's jump into it. So you have been kind enough to join me this evening to discuss a paper that was recently published, and please correct me if I get any of this wrong. It was recently published in the Ave Maria Law Review, the paper being titled The 21st Century Catholic Lawyer. So the title jumped out at me as a Catholic lawyer. And I've been fortunate enough to know, to interview you and speak with you previously. And I know you're a Catholic lawyer, so it was just so relevant to my life and the life of other people around me. Just a preliminary question: what is the Ave Maria Law Review? I feel somewhat ashamed that I'm not too familiar.
Ave Maria is a Catholic law school, so it's quite a small but very good Catholic law school. So I was keen to encourage them to my papers. So the genesis of this paper is actually a talk which I gave at Notre Dame to the St. Thomas More Society. So that's sort of where origins are. But obviously I did a lot more work on it before it was published. Yeah, so Ave Maria Law School is one to know about. It's a good law school. It's good work.
Okay. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed the paper, and maybe I've prepared a few little points that I'm hoping to be able to flesh out with you over the course of this discussion. But maybe if we start by taking a step back and giving a bit of an overview of the paper's theme, and I don't want to steal that away from you, you being the author.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's a paper about what it means to be a Catholic lawyer in the 21st century and the challenges that we face today. So it looks at the nature of lawyers in Australia. It asks the question that you say many lawyers ask themselves. I'm not so sure that's true, about whether it makes sense to talk about a legal profession in Australia today, or whether it's more appropriate to talk about a law business, which is a horrendous expression if you ask me, that you sometimes hear. It looks at the contemporary challenges for Catholic lawyers in the 21st century. And really those challenges arise from the fact that the position of Christians, the sheer numbers, percentage-wise, of people who self-identify as Christians is in decline in this country. And the number of Australians, I think, who look to their religious traditions, their religious faith, as the guidance for their moral positions, I think, is also in decline, which means that law becomes more and more important. I think that there's a growing number of Australians who look to the law, and Americans for that matter, who look to the law as the guide of what's morally right and morally wrong, which is rather bizarre because parliamentarians on the whole would reject the proposition that they're engaged in anything moral in their lawmaking, that they're engaged in some kind of moral arbitrage about what citizens should. And similarly, most judges would also reject the view that they're engaged in any kind of moral enterprise. But nonetheless, I think most Australians no longer have a guidance from their religious traditions for what is moral, but actually have the parameters for morality set by the law. So that I think leads to some really significant challenges for Australian lawyers, particularly Australian Catholic lawyers, in terms of the way in which the law is formed, as by the parliaments, where lawyers are massively overrepresented. I think it's 1/5 of 1% of the population in Australia are lawyers, but they're about 35% of parliamentarians in any Australian parliament. And then questions about what the laws mean go to judges and are argued before judges by lawyers, and ultimately determined by lawyers who are the judges, even up to the High Court on constitutional questions and as the final court of appeal. So just from that brief explanation, you can see how incredibly important it is for lawyers to be aware of their power and their position, and for Catholic lawyers in particular, I argue, to be aware of what it means to be a Catholic lawyer and to think very carefully about what kind of Catholic lawyer they're going to be.
I think that was just such a concise summary of the entire paper. I was going through ticking off.
Now, Tom.
Yeah, that was wonderful. And well, before I jump into a couple of my points, just to hit on a couple of the points you just raised, I remember when I started and sort of, being brought up a Catholic and then being thrown into the study of the law and then the practice of the law, trying to reconcile my Catholic roots with my legal education, because the legal education was completely pluralistic. You do jurisprudence, you touch on philosophy, but it really is this smorgasbord of influences that form what we would call the practice of the law in Australia today. And I think there are strong arguments to suggest that the laws we have today are founded on Judeo-Christian Western legal heritage. But there was this, I remember one of quite an embarrassing story. I was a judge's associate, and I was sitting in the car with the judge I worked for at the time. We were off to do a trial. I think it was the first trial I ever sat on. And we were talking about a matter, and I just had this very sort of natural law approach to what was actually a really complicated issue that I just could not possibly comprehend at the time. And I remember just going, hang on, why is the law so difficult? And why is he making something that's so obvious complicated? And, little did I know, 5 years later, I'm looking back at that version of myself going, oh, if I only knew how complicated this is. But I think the law is an industry that is really complicated, especially for a Catholic Christian that has concrete philosophical roots in a tradition.
Yeah, well, I think that's true, but I also think that, and this is the point I make in the paper, that it's critical for all Catholics to really understand their faith and understand their own ethical principles before entering the profession. I mean, I'm not the first person to recognise that if you become a lawyer in Australia, particularly if you work in a large firm, but really in any firm, I think, you're likely to face ethical challenges from very early on in your career. And I think this is something I impress upon to my students, because the tendency for young law students is to think, well, why are we learning all this ethics stuff? There's going to be partners in the law firm who are going to deal with all the ethics. Why do we need to worry about that? But in fact, as you know, Tom, most young lawyers go to work in firms where time is money and billable hour is king. And so joining a firm and being set targets or expectations for billable hours from very early on in your career, there's a great temptation for all young lawyers to gild the lily a bit and slightly exaggerate their hours in order to make sure they meet their targets.
I've never done
it. And for all lawyers, for all people, the first time you do something which is morally wrong, you might feel bad about it. But once you've done it a few times and nobody's noticed, and your billable hours are starting to improve, these things can become endemic, and they probably are a systematic problem within our legal profession, although no one really would want to talk about it, and you certainly wouldn't have any support from a partner if they found out that's what you had been doing. But nonetheless, the point I'm making is simply that knowing who you are, knowing what you're prepared to do to advance your career and what you're not prepared to do, isn't something to put off for some future time. It's something that you need to have really worked out in your head before you start in the profession. Because the worst time to be grappling with these sorts of problems is when you're facing them. The best time to grapple with an ethical problem is when you've got the cold light of reason and you can actually think issues through.
Mm. And they're not just issues of education only, they'd be issues of habit and learning how to make the learning and the ethics part of your life and yourself. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So I'll kick off with a few of the points I had. So firstly, the thing I took away from this paper on my first read was this was really a wake-up call, as we've discussed, for Catholics in the workforce, professional workforce, more particularly lawyers, because it's no secret that, to my mind anyway, we live and we work in a profession that is arguably, I would suggest, anti-Catholic. And so it's very important that we recognise that, if that is the case, so we can ask the question, well, how do we respond to that? So my first question for you would be, in section 2 of your paper, you break down make the distinction between a profession and a business. And one of the funnest things about being a lawyer, this is the stuff that they teach you very early on, the nobility of the profession. It's not just about money making, you're rising above that, and you're trying to attain a standard of conduct, which is why, you know, there's Australian solicitors' conduct rules and all these ethical obligations that are imposed on lawyers, barristers, judges, the whole profession, because it is not a profit-making scheme. It's a moral profession. It seems to be that these days, a lot of big firms who are profit-driven allow the profit to turn them away from doing what we would suggest to be right. Do you think that a lot of big corporations have become anti-Catholic because they're profit-driven, or is it possible that people have just started to embrace anti-Catholic ideologies?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. I think the first thing I would say is that there's nothing wrong with making a profit, and there's nothing wrong with money in and of itself. It's about having balance. This gets back to what we were talking about before, actually, Tom, about knowing yourself and knowing what you're about. Because, you know, working in a big firm, particularly if you're lucky enough, as I was, to be invited to join the partnership, means that you can make a significant amount of money. That can lead to a lot of temptation. And a lot of lawyers, I'm sure you've come across them, and succumb to that temptation, and earning money and the prestige overtakes everything else in their life, and that becomes the be all and end all. But, you know, that's not a Christian way of living. And as Ecclesiastes said, what do people gain from the efforts they make? So the point of life isn't just to make money, but if you make a lot of money, that means that you can provide for your family. That means that you can set aside money for charity, and you can actually use money in positive ways. Money itself isn't the problem, but it's what your drive is, what your motivation is, and keeping focused on the end game, which of course is eternal salvation. It can be easy to get distracted from that. But I do think that the law remains a profession, and I do think that there are many people working in the law who aren't driven solely by the profit motive and the desire to make as much money as they possibly can. And you see that even in people who don't subscribe to the Catholic worldview and have abandoned that in favour of what I describe in the paper as the revisionist worldview. Some misguided people talk about that as being some progressive worldview, but I think it's not progressive necessarily, or at all. But even those people look for more in their life than money, so they try to find something of meaning in their legal professional careers by dedicating a proportion of their time to pro bono work. I've been on some panels at times judging prizes that are given to various law firms and solicitors and lawyers, and I've been on the pro bono prize at times, and been unable to find anything submitted by any of the firms which I would actually think was in the public good, because those people are driven by different motivations than those of the Catholic worldview. That doesn't mean that they're bad people. It just means that, you know, the way that they've been brought up, the principles that they've lived by, are shallow and meaningless. But that's the way it is. You know. If you don't mind, while we're talking about the profession, I might just take you to some extracts from a really good book which I've read recently. I might have mentioned it last time we spoke, I'm not sure. It's by Yuval Levin. I don't know whether you've come across him. But the book is called The Time to Build. It's published by Basic Books in 2020. And he says on page 87, in the legal profession, elite law schools in particular have increasingly been transformed into battlegrounds in the culture war, and the profession has gradually been shorn of its strong, confident, formative identity. Lawyers have a distinct place in our particular social order as interpreters of the legal frameworks of democratic life, as careful reformers of those frameworks, and as agents of fellow citizens in need of prudent counsel. A professional code that accustoms even the most elite lawyers to serve as agents of others, and that holds them to a standard that has more to do with integrity than with raw intellect, would be one useful way to help humble them and to legitimate their standing and their privileges. That kind of professional ethic is by no means gone altogether, but particularly in its elite precincts, the legal profession is increasingly unrestrained by it. And I think that's a perfect explanation of the problem that we grapple with when we're in legal practice, and which is really behind this paper that I've written that we're talking about today.
So if we were to look at, by way of an example, the marriage plebiscite back in whenever it was a long time ago now,
2018, I think.
18, wow. And I remember there was always discussions around the water cooler as to, you know, all the big corporations, whether it was big mining companies, big accounting firms, big law firms, taking these big public stances on the issue, almost this unbreakable alliance in favour of the redefinition of marriage. And the question that was going through not just my mind, I think at the time, was, do these big firms genuinely believe in this cause, or are these decisions that are in the best interests of the stakeholders in terms of maximising the profit to the company? So, I guess not much really comes of that to me, because either way, both approaches are incorrect. But to your mind, what did you think was the cause behind that at the time?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a tendency for people to spend a lot of time with other people who share their same worldview. And I think that's part of the problem. But also, you've got to pay credit where credit is due. The people who were pushing for the redefinition of marriage did their job extremely well. It did take them quite a long period of time. But even the phraseology of marriage equality is very powerful. You know, nobody wants to be challenging equality. And unless you actually think through what that really means, and analyse the question of what marriage actually means, which is something which most people in our society have forgotten, I think, and understand, you know, the reason why governments ever became involved in, societies ever became involved in recognising marriages as something that the law gives some kind of imprimatur to. Unless you recognise those things and look at the history of why that happened, and recognise the fact that there's lots of different forms of marriage. This is the reality of the nonsensical phraseology of marriage equality, because what does it really mean to talk about marriage equality? was used as a vehicle to redefine marriage to include within the context of state recognised marriage a new group of people who would not otherwise have been recognised. But it certainly doesn't recognise every form of marriage that's recognised in other cultures and other societies in our world and in Australia. So it still leaves unrecognised by our Marriage Act, for example, Indigenous cultural marriages. They've never been recognised as marriage under the Marriage Act in Australia. Well, where's the equality? Where's the equity there? It leaves unrecognised plural marriages or polygamous marriages, which are recognised in other religious traditions, which have thousands of years of history, whereas the form of marriage which was added to the Marriage Act as a result of that plebiscite is something of very recent history. So where's the equality for people with those forms of marriage as their understanding of the tradition? So it's an alluring kind of thing, the way in which language is used. And if you're not careful and if you don't actually think things through, it can be beguiling, and you can fall into the trap of thinking, well, yes, this is a matter of equality. This is we're treating people, we're discriminating against people, rather than asking the question, well, why prefer this particular this particular form of relationship with something called marriage? Does it actually have substance? Is there some meaning behind it? Does it have a natural law foundation? Or is it something which just, as the High Court found in the Commonwealth and ACT, is just a juristic term that actually has no content?
I'm at risk of departing from the structure of this chat, but I'm going to go with it because I can't resist following on. So the answer to that question from me would be, it absolutely made no sense. I mean, I can remember how many beers I had with friends who were, we were on opposing sides of the debate, but if pressed hard enough on that issue, it was patently obvious that what you said made sense in terms of the European Court of Human Rights, I think has previously written on the subject, and you articulate that in your paper. Essentially, there was no need in terms of people of same-sex relationships having the same rights as those of married couples. The infrastructure for that was already present in the Australian legislation in a number of different forms. The issue was whether or not they could apply the definition or the word marriage to those relationships, and they could not. And so based on the unpacking of that issue that you just gave, to me, that would suggest that the whole thing was a war against Christian tradition rather than anything else. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that in the revisionist worldview, there's a different understanding of dignity from the understanding that dignity has within the Catholic tradition. So in the Catholic tradition, as you know, because we were created in the image of God, we all have innate intrinsic dignity. It's not something that can be given to us or taken away. It's something that we're born with, and it predates the state, and as does marriage. So marriage has a foundation which you find in Scripture, but even leaving aside Scripture, marriage existed before states existed. So the reason why states originally got involved in recognising marriage was a desire to ensure that families had consistency, and that in days before DNA testing and so on, children born within a particular relationship could be recognised as being people that were to be protected and reared within that relationship. And the state wanted more people, more citizens to be born within those kind of traditional families to produce good citizens. So the state had an interest in that kind of relationship and giving recognition to that relationship in that particular way. So there's no doubt that people who experience same-sex attraction and exhibit that in their lives in Western societies have been treated differently to people who don't have that experience and don't exhibit that publicly. and negatively. I think we'd have to accept that that's been the case, and there's been terrible violence and unfair discrimination against people with that characteristic in the past. And so many people felt that it's important to rectify those historical wrongs. And one way of recognising those historical wrongs would be by the state recognising the dignity of those relationships between two people of the same sex as being equal in dignity to the relationship between two people of the opposite sex. Of course, that kind of way of thinking about dignity is different to that way of understanding dignity that I mentioned before. Dignity is an intrinsic thing we're born with because we're human beings. It's not something that can be given to us by the state. And the idea of dignity as something which can be given by the state is a very, very old-fashioned kind of way of thinking about dignity, which has had this revival, So historically, we had feudal lords, and we had knights, and we had dames, and we had people who were given their status by the state. So their dignity was something which was actually given to them by the state, rather than something which was intrinsic. And this way of thinking about marriage is something divvied out to people who have been unjustly or unfairly treated in the past, in order to give their relationships dignity. It's a very unusual way of thinking about dignity, and it's a quite a different way. It's a different worldview about what dignity actually is.
It also sounds quite dangerous, potentially.
Well, I think I've actually discussed this in a paper which was published in the University of Notre Dame Law Review before marriage was redefined, which looked at the reality that there are a multiplicity of forms of marriage in the world and in Australia which wouldn't be recognised. And so, in a sense, the equality which was given by that redefinition of marriage is a very strange kind of equality, and a strange way, and I would argue an unjust, discriminatory way of affording dignity to some people who I'm not arguing have not been discriminated unfairly against in the past, but not giving the same treatment to other groups of people. I mean, if you look at marriage, for example, can you really say that? Well, you can't say that our Indigenous peoples have not been unfairly discriminated against and unfairly treated in the past. And I don't think you can say that the same isn't true of followers of the Islamic traditions, who have been treated poorly and unfairly discriminated against in Australian history. I don't think there's really a question about that. And so then that becomes a question of how do we choose which groups of people we're going to include in the marriage category in order to give dignity to them, and which we're not. And we never had a discussion about that. We never actually. And I think this isn't really what we're here to talk about, Tom. But this is a complaint which could be levelled at all sides of that issue when it was, inverted commas, debated before the plebiscite took place, because we never actually had a discussion about what marriage means in Australia. What does marriage actually mean, if anything?
And I appreciate that this wasn't what we were here to discuss, but it's an interesting conversation. If that conversation had been had, let's say you were a moderator, what would you have injected into that conversation?
Well, where it would have taken us, I'm not sure, because the whole issue wouldn't have been resolved the way it was had most people in Australia had that traditional natural law understanding of what marriage is actually about. And understanding coming from the Catholic worldview of recognising the difference between men and women and their compatibility and the different things that they bring to a relationship, which are different to a relationship between any other two people.
Mm-hmm. And there seems to be this fine line, and it's something that Professor John Finnis, I once saw him give a lecture. I think it was at Oxford at some point a while ago. It was one of the most enjoyable lectures I think I've ever seen. But effectively, he emphasises the importance of lawyers not stepping over that line into judicial activism, because that is the role of the parliaments. They're not equipped. And I mean, of course, there's always going to be an element of judge-made law and the development of law. But where does one draw that line? Because you've got cultures coming together, you've got everybody bringing their own personal perspectives, whereas the law is meant to be concrete as much as it can. That's what gives society its stability. And part of the issue that I think Catholics are noticing today is it's an ideological battle. And so when you've got an ideological battle taking place in an arena that's meant to be solid, it's quite confusing.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good argument for Catholics becoming engaged in the law and actually being appointed to the judiciary. Australia hasn't been as exposed to this problem of judicial activism as some other parts of the world, particularly the United States and Canada. And that's largely because our constitution is almost entirely a rights-free document, because we didn't federate for anything to do with human rights. We federated for the good old-fashioned Australian principles of how do we make as much money as we can, and how do we ensure that we control who comes into our country. They were the main reasons that we federated: defence and removing trade barriers, removing the barriers between states. We've been busily reinstituting because of COVID-19. So our judiciary doesn't engage in quite as significant a level of judicial activism as you see in the United States and Canada. But I think that the principles of the rule of law and parliamentary supremacy really do make it important that judges resist to engage in judicial activism as much as they can. And that's because, for the reasons that you said, we live in a pluralist society. And increasingly we have people with different worldviews and different religious traditions who are living in this country, and people with no faith entirely. And people have the opportunity of being elected to a parliament. And even if they're not elected to a parliament, when a parliament is, they have the opportunity of, which they regularly do, of inviting submissions. We've got this happening in New South Wales at the moment because there's a proposal for religious belief to be added to the characteristics which are protected by our discrimination laws in New South Wales, when they're not at the moment. So Parliament's called for written submissions. People have the chance to make submissions. Then the committee will hear from witnesses. There'll be records kept of all of that. And there's a debate in Parliament ultimately if legislation is coming forward. So you get the chance as citizens to vote for people who represent you. Then they get the chance in the Parliament to represent their constituents, and that's how you make laws. Judges, on the other hand, come from a very small group of people. And just because a judge thinks this is the way in which something should be resolved for the betterment of others, doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case. And if Parliament's decided something to be written in a particular way, then I think judges should be very careful about departing from that. In the United States, for example, just to demonstrate the fact that judicial activism can really depart from one of the basic principles of the rule of law, which is that citizens are entitled to know the law so that they can modify their behaviours in accordance with the law. So they'll know if they're engaged in some behaviours that will fall foul of the law, and they'll know if they're engaged in some other behaviours that will be rewarded by the law. So if you think of I don't know whether you're familiar with the United States Supreme Court decision from earlier this year, which is Bostock and Clayton County, Georgia, where the United States Supreme Court, through some very careful, and I'm not using that in a positive way, legal reasoning, managed to find that legislation which prescribed discrimination on the basis of sex also prescribed discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in circumstances where parliaments had debated the potential to amend the legislation had not done so to include that characteristic as a protected characteristic. So I don't think judges should engage in sophistry. I think they should read the legislation and apply it in accordance with its terms. Or in Australia, at least we have the benefit of interpretation legislation, which enables courts to have a look at what Parliament actually intended, where it's uncertain what the law actually means, so they can look at the reading speeches and so on. So there's really no excuse from departing from Parliament's intention when you're interpreting legislation in Australia. And yet, you know, judges do that. Judges do, in interpreting the Constitution, for example, in the Commonwealth and ACT case, just going back to that marriage question for a second, come up with an entirely new definition of marriage, which you would never have found in any dictionary and certainly wouldn't have been contemplated by anyone at the time of Federation. So, you know, I just think that judicial humility is an important characteristic. And if judges don't like what the law is, then they're perfectly entitled to say that in delivering their judgment. And that gives Parliament the chance to revisit the law and amend the law if that's what they want to do later.
Two questions on that point. Do you think that it's impossible to avoid the perfect situation where those lines are really adhered to because the nature of a profession, there's almost a provocation for individuals to take moral stances on something? And my second question, just so I don't forget it, is also that the same issue arising by virtue of living in a pluralistic society where you have clashes of fundamental beliefs, whether at a parliamentary level, whether at a legalistic level. It's a slightly different issue, but it's a very, very, when you think about the idea of Catholics and Muslims and atheists and all other people from different belief systems coming together and living together in a community and being able to live their belief systems together, theoretically, it's very, very difficult. If not impossible, and you'd go, it's no wonder why we're confronted with some of these issues. So, sorry, those were 2 points I raised, but if we can discuss those, if you remember.
Well, I think I'll struggle, I think, but I think it's important in our society to recognise that difference is part of our society, and that's okay, and to recognise that people have different worldviews, and that's okay. What's not okay is to adopt a position where that reality is completely ignored, and for the state to dictate what people should believe. And that's a point which I make in the paper, where I refer, if I can find it, an excellent quote here from my good friend Dr. Ian Benson, which I'm probably not going to be able to find now, where he makes the point that that's not the role of the state. You know, the state should recognise that people can have different perspectives, and the state should be loath to force people to live in a way which is inconsistent with their actual beliefs.
I'm just racing you to see if I can find the actual quote.
Here it is. Here it's on page 52, where Dr. Benson says, "We need to be wary of claims that a particular position represents the state interest. More often than not, what is at issue is a contestable viewpoint. The state interest is multiple, not singular. The state, simply put, should not have only one view on controversial matters. These are questions that the state should keep as open as far as possible." And I think Ian's completely correct there. Obviously, there will be circumstances where the law needs to take a position. And it won't surprise you that my view about how you judge whether the state should be and is appropriately taking a position is by natural law criteria. You know, and that's the litmus test and the argument against the propositions that I was putting before about judicial activism, because there is a place for judicial activism and that place is where the parliaments have enacted laws which are contrary to the natural law, and so those laws, as you and I would agree, are not laws properly so called. So what happened in Nazi Germany couldn't have happened if it wasn't for the positivist position which was taken by the judiciary. If the judiciary had applied basic natural law viewpoints about the dignity of all human beings simply because we're human beings, then that regime just couldn't have happened. So there is an important role for judges. That's why we have separation of powers. But that role is to be exercised with judicial humility, in my view.
And do you think, going back to that first question I asked, so I'm surprised I haven't actually forgotten it. Do you think by virtue of the legal profession being a profession, it's almost wishful thinking to hope that people, given the opportunity to be judicial activists, won't be so? Because in theory, it's all well and good to just go, it's important to maintain these distinctions and don't do it. But then when given the opportunity and the moral element of being a lawyer, would it almost be impossible for some to abstain from doing it?
Yeah, thank you for asking me that question and reminding me of it, because I think this gets back to what we were talking about before when we were talking about the fact that so many people, I would argue, in Australian society, in Western society, look to the law as the moral blueprint. Look for the actual law as a moral blueprint rather than looking to sources which might be a better source for morality. So that poses really critical questions, as I mentioned earlier, for our parliaments and for our judges. But I don't think either of those parts of our society are actually equipped or that go through any kind of mandatory training to equip them to make moral judgments. At Notre Dame, legal philosophy is a mandatory subject. In some law schools, jurisprudence or legal philosophy is mandatory, but in many it's not. And in many where it is taught, it's not taught in a way which considers the range of legal philosophies that there are. So there are legal philosophies consistent with the Catholic worldview. There are legal philosophies, the majority of which will be taught in our public universities, which are completely antithetical to the Catholic worldview, and look to advance other ways of thinking. So if you've got a judiciary which is trained, if they've dealt with legal philosophy at all, which is not mandatory, there's no necessity in most law schools to have dealt with that at all. They will ethics, but ethics from a black letter law kind of approach, where you're looking at the solicitor's conduct rules, for example, which are really important because they contain the answers to some very gnarly ethical questions which have arisen in the past, and working out what the right answer to some of those problems is bamboozling. But they haven't necessarily been trained in or formed in any moral tradition or any ethical tradition which has deep substance.
And being formed in an ethical tradition, would you say, goes beyond just an education sort of front? It's a living it and growing in virtue. And I know that sounds very high level and maybe a bit naive, too moralistic, but do you think it's sort of interesting where in a world and a society where virtue has really been rejected, the doing good and what used to be considered evil has really been embraced across the board in the name of personal freedoms, when it comes to grappling with some of these moral dilemmas, it's almost like we're completely unequipped as a society to be able to grapple with them effectively.
Yes, I agree. But I'd rather my parliament, which is actually made up of a lot of people, and actually can and does usually seek submissions from people who actually have thought about the issues more deeply. Parliaments deal with a lot of things, so you can't expect them to be to be comprised of specialists in all areas. Same with judges. But at least if Parliament's passing legislation, they can hear from tens of thousands of people's submissions. And they might even actually influence the outcome. They might even influence the outcome. Where a court just can't do that. You know, even if a court gives standing, it can only give standing to a couple of interest groups. It can't actually hear from a lot of people.
Very, very true. Another section in your paper, section 3. And I very much enjoyed that because you take the time to list out quite concisely many of the benefits that Western society has that have been brought to them by Christian tradition: education, philosophy, morality, dignity, human rights, these things that we take for granted at a grassroots level. It doesn't occur to the vast majority of the population that they come from the Christian, come from a Christian culture. But at this point in time, the world really seems to be convulsed in a conflict based on certain groups of people waging war directly on the Christian tradition, it would seem. So, for an example, you look at what's going on over in America at the moment, and I'm not quite brave enough to say that I think that the American election is coming down to a fight against good and evil. But from at least a superficial level, if you look at policies, it's quite interesting because it seems to be that you've got the God camp, and this camp that has put its flag up, which is very anti-God and socialist. You know, there's more to it than that. But you've got groups that are really attacking the Christian culture of America, and you've got similar groups out here. So as Catholic lawyers, because it's inevitable that, you know, the law and the legal profession is just a microcosm of a wider society, a lot of these attitudes and approaches are going to permeate their way through into our lives. How should we confront these issues and deal with them? What should we think about them to start with?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is to be clear about our own positions and be able to articulate and understand why those positions are held. And I think that's a fundamental flaw. That's a fundamental flaw for many Catholics. You know, they haven't thought deeply about their faith, and they haven't actually understood or ever attempted to understand why the church holds particular positions on particular things. You know, and the marriage one, I don't want to keep going back to marriage, but the marriage thing is a very clear indicator of that. You know, most Catholics, I think, or people who have been baptized as Catholics hadn't really been formed in an understanding of what marriage really means and seen the difference, the movement away from the state's position on that question and from the true position. I think the United States is a really interesting example. I don't know if I would put things quite as starkly as you just have. The United States is different to Australia because we have compulsory voting here. In the United States, you're pushing to get people out to vote. So very much to polarised and extreme positions, particularly leading up to an election. And you'll see that leading up to this election probably more than others. But at least in the United States, people talk about pro-life issues. Talk about pro-life issues. They're just not talked about in Australia, you know. Whilst in the United States, many of the states have been enacting legislation to try to improve protection for the unborn. In Australia, we've gone in completely the opposite direction in New South Wales and Queensland in recent years without any fanfare, really. You know, there was a bit of an imbroglio in New South Wales because the New South Wales Parliament was trying to push through changes to completely decriminalise the termination of pregnancies without any proper scrutiny, which at least led to the very truncated, but at least led to the Parliament hearing submissions, and the legislation, horrendous as it is, was better than it would have been had it just passed without that. But you know, these things are just not on the discussion board in Australia, whereas at least in the United States they are. but I think that the extreme positions taken by Anna and so on, and actually the revisionist worldview probably isn't held by everybody. It's held by some powerful groups of people within Western societies. But I don't know that it's the mainstream position. We'll find out the outcome. We'll find out the answer to that, I think, in the US election. And I think we found the answer to that actually in the election of the Morrison government, where not as extreme as in the United States, but definitely at least was a perception of a rejection of respect for Christian principles and for religion in one side of politics, which was not present in the other. Whether that's fair or not is a different question, because there's definitely some very strong Catholics and good people in both sides of politics. But that perception certainly arose, and I'm pretty sure that was a significant factor in the election of the Morrison government. You know, I think most people in Australia, most people in the United States just want to live ordinary family lives, and they have, you know, you can talk about them as being particularly Catholic or particularly Christian. A lot of these things are just natural ways of thinking. They're not ideological, and they reject that kind of ideology of anti-family, anti-religious faith.
If we were to refer back to the marriage plebiscite, and I think a point you made in your paper was you had public bodies, i.e. law societies and bar associations, not just privatised companies, coming out and throwing their support. I guess two elements to that. The first observation was it was very, very interesting at the time being a young lawyer, because lawyers, being professionals, you know, the moral element, to be seen to have been opposed to something that what I thought the everyday person was in favour for because of this misunderstanding of dignity. It was very, very confronting, because people look to lawyers. You know, I think a lot of people roll their eyes when they hear the term lawyer, and, you know, some people go, you know, they're all crooks and throw them out. But I don't think that's entirely true. I think there is a large body of people who look to lawyers when it comes to these tight situations, because lawyers as bodies stand for something. And so to be on the wrong side of a fight like that, it was at the time, I remember feeling quite confronted. I was at a larger firm at the time, and I was not hard to believe, the minority. But on a bigger scale, you had, I remember, bar associations and law societies making public written statements, and you had responses to them. I think the Thomas More Society wrote a very articulate response. But the fact still remained. There was an enormous power imbalance, and it looked to me like the vast majority of people, though by virtue of a very, very fundamental misunderstanding, were in favour of redefining marriage as it truly is, in favour of something that it isn't. And I guess that was just how I saw that. But do you think there's a danger of that becoming, you know, a larger and larger scale? People, even though they misunderstand, working against Christian culture?
Yeah, well, I think that is true, and that's really our fault, you know, and I think it's our fault, our failure to articulate the true position and what we actually believe, and also our failure to live as Christians should do. You know, if we want people to respect us, and we want people to respect our worldview, they've got to see that it's beneficial, and that it's logical, and that it's not just evil, poisonous discrimination, which is arbitrary and hateful. So we can easily lose that, we can easily be characterized falsely. And it's fair enough that we are, when so many people who say that they are Christians are living in completely hypocritical ways. And so people don't actually see good role models or good demonstrations of what it means to be a Christian. But I also think that we need to recognise that there are different worldviews in our society, and if to be consistent with our own worldview, if we believe that our worldview is actually true and actually for the public good and for the best betterment of our society, that's something we need to persuade people of, and that requires us to actually be actively involved in our society. Most people don't want to be elected to law societies and to bar councils. That's a lot of work, and most people don't want to be involved in political parties or in associations and organisations. All those things take time, but being involved in those sorts of organisations is really, really important, because you get the chance, if you are involved in those organisations, to influence others. Chance as a lawyer to influence others, because as you say, people do, despite all of the misbehaviours of lawyers over the years, and we're going to see more of that now that Victoria's allowing lawyers to take part of the proceeds of damages claims. They still do look up to lawyers. And lawyers have a really important place as advocates for truth. We need to be conscious of that, and we need not to shy away from it. That doesn't mean that everyone that's a Catholic lawyer needs to be politically engaged and an advocate. As one of the points that I make in this paper, which I think is very important, that we're all given different gifts and talents. So what it means to be a Catholic lawyer for one person might mean working in a big firm, earning a significant amount of money and using that money for really good purposes. For another lawyer, it might mean seeking election to the Law Society or to the Bar Council and being actively involved in that level of politics. To another, it might mean dedicating time to pro bono activities, either in the law or in charitable enterprises. So there's lots of different ways to be a Catholic and lots of different ways to be a Catholic lawyer. The question that I pose at the end of the paper is, what kind of Catholic lawyer are you? And that's not something that you're going to know osmosis. That's something that you've actually got to turn your mind to. Is your faith important to you? If it is important to you, why is it important to you? And what does it actually comprise? What are the moral precepts behind the Catholic faith, and why do they make sense if they do? And if they do make sense, and if they are the truth, and if our society would be better if people actually lived in a Christian way, if we had stable families, if we had less divorce, if we had less abortion, if we don't go down the path which we're increasingly going down towards euthanasia, if we actually cared about people and we weren't selfish, would the society we live in be better? I think the answer to that. But that's not going to happen without people demonstrating their faith, without it being evident to people that, look at those people, they're in a stable family, they love each other, look at their children, they're well adjusted. That sort of thing's powerful. You can go back to the origins of the growth of Christianity. It's not because we were the same as everybody else, but it was because we weren't hypocrites, and because Christians lived in a different way. They had families, they didn't put their children out to the elements to die, they didn't have abortion, they didn't have contraception. They lived in a different way, they were charitable, they paid for the burial of people who had no money. That sort of thing is attractive. People actually see that that's a better way of living. And unless Christians are living that better way of living, people will think they're hypocritical, which is fair enough. If Christians aren't really living the whole package, and they're just complaining about the redefinition of marriage, or complaining about the lack of religious freedom for Catholic schools, then it's fair enough to say that they're bigoted and discriminatory, because the foundation for their whole way of life isn't laid. You can see looking in, you can see how it just doesn't look right.
I must say, I love the way you ended the paper, because you've set the scene, you've wound it up, and then you ask this open-ended question where it almost just propels the reader out onto this decision. And on that point, that's so interesting, because one of the core elements to being Catholic is to be apostolic. It's faith, hope, and the greatest of these is charity. So having all the knowledge in the world. I think it's page 1 of The Imitation of Christ. You know, it's useless knowing the Trinity if you don't please the Trinity. So the fundamental element of being a Catholic is living a Catholic life. And so I really found your paper almost like a call to arms and a call to action for Catholics, especially Catholic lawyers, to go out and not just be Catholic lawyers, but to just be basic 101, you know, be good Catholics. And that's loving your neighbour, being charitable, being kind, because you're dead right. It is so easy. And you don't have to look around to see examples of it, and also reflecting and seeing examples of it in your own life. It's so easy to get riled and want to hit everybody with a big stick. But that's not the Catholic way. It is a religion. It's the true religion of love. And so if you have all the negatives without the love, you are not Catholic. But that answers the question I was going to ask you, because one of the points I wanted to make was it seems to be there can sort of be two factions to what you term to be the revisionist worldview. People who are revisionist by virtue of a lack of understanding and a lack of education. But then, do you think it's fair to say there could be minorities or bodies of people who are of bad will, you know, who have made it their modus operandi to destroy the church? And every once in a while, you know, you find these groups of people and you go, in the face of this, what does one do? But I think the obvious answer to that would be, you be Catholic.
Yeah, well, I think it's important not to fall into the trap of thinking that people who have the revisionist worldview or don't share our worldview are evil people and have some evil motivations. Because from their perspective, that's not the position at all. In fact, they'd say the opposite is true. They'd say that those Christians, those Catholics are just judgmental bigots, you know. So it's important to do our best to understand where people are coming from and understand what their motivations are and what their arguments are, and try, you know, it takes two to tango. You know, we can't expect people to understand us and to be tolerant of us and be tolerant of our way of life, and to accept the idea, even the idea that you might want to have a school, where only people from your religious tradition teach or study there. You know, that seems preposterous and discriminatory to many people. But if you actually really want to celebrate diversity, which is a catchphrase of many people, and if you want to actually achieve equality, then you have to recognise difference. Religious beliefs respecting religious belief is part of an equality equation. You know, religious beliefs are part of the characteristics of people. They're not something that can just be brushed off as meaningless to everybody, and that's part of the problem. You know, a lot of people know people who they think of as being religious because they come from a particular tradition, but they don't live in accordance with that tradition in any way, and it's ceased to have any real meaning for them, and it's a thing for them. But otherwise, they live their life in exactly the same way as everybody else. except when there's some kind of issue we really feel strongly about. And then you can see, you know, it's a legitimate complaint to say that those people are using their religion to justify discrimination or whatever. It's important for people. It's important, and this is a two-way street, as I said. But this is the real challenge that we have as a society, to try to understand where everybody's coming from, you know, and try to persuade people to our perspective. You know, preaching the gospel always, sometimes using words, and having logical. I mean, as lawyers, this is a key thing that we should be able to do. You know, have logical, carefully constructed foundations to explain our position. That's what we learn as lawyers, and to do so dispassionately. And it's hard to do this when you're talking to someone who's got a position which you're completely opposed to. But it's a critical skill for lawyers. You know, we learn to do it in our professional life. You know, we'll put a position.
I'm still trying.
Yeah, but you know, if you're having if you're dealing with a debate about a contract, or if you're dealing with any piece of litigation, you know that the people on the end are saying something that's completely idiotic. You still use persuasion and explanation to bring them around. Yeah. You know, and it's the same in all walks of life.
Very, very interesting. Towards the end of your paper, you encourage Catholic professionals and Catholic lawyers to come together, join for collegiate support, because it is, it'd be safe to say, practicing Catholic lawyers are a minority. So, you know, safety in numbers, birds of a feather flock together. What would you say, though, to the problem that seems to arise because the Catholic lawyers coming together themselves have competing views about many of these fundamental social issues, and not just at a Catholic lawyer level. One looks around at the church today, and it seems to be an interesting time to be a Catholic, because from the top all the way down to the bottom, there seem to be a lot of things that, you know, for at least arguably 2,000 years were fundamental Catholic principles, which are being vigorously debated today. And so I think you've even mentioned previously in conversation that it can be difficult to form a solid Catholic support core because of by virtue of these issues. So what would your suggestions be on that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And it made me think, because you gave me a forewarning that you might ask me this question, of a letter in the Catholic Weekly this week, actually, from someone named Peter Doonan. And his letter started off by saying that conflict and debate are integral to Catholicism. As early as 50 AD at the Council of Jerusalem, Peter and Paul held opposite views around Mosaic law, including circumcision, but prayerful discernment helped maintain church unity. Yeah, I think the plenary council is pulling out the very issue that you mentioned. But it's clear from Scripture that we're to be of one mind with Christ, so there can't be more than one truth. Ultimately, we've got to search for the truth, and if we're true to the Catholic tradition, the truth's to be found in the magisterium. That's the position I would take, and I think this is really the at the core of my suggestion that Catholics look for collegiality. And it's also at the core of the other problem which we've been talking about, actually, which is that a lot of people will know people who they think are Catholics, who think, when they think of Catholics, they think of those people who are living their life in exactly the same way as everybody else. And so when you have Catholics who seek to live their life in a way which is true to the magisterium, you know, and Catholics who are concerned about the link to abortion in the Oxford COVID-19 vaccine, for example, they just think that they're just completely weird freaks, you know. And that's why I think it is important for Catholics who are motivated by their faith and seek to live their life in accordance with their faith and seek to live their life in accordance with the magisterium in particular, to be collegiate and to know each other. You know, one of the things which is a real trap in the profession is that Catholics, Christians, religious people in general tend to be very quiet about their position because everyone wants to be liked and everyone wants to be like everybody else. But the reality is we're not like everybody else. We have a code of behaviour which we have to abide by, which puts us in a different position to other people. And we need to recognise that we're a minority. You know, the people, when you look at the census, you'll see that the people who self-identify as Catholic are the highest proportion of Christian denominations. But that's not telling you the number of people who are really motivated by their Catholic faith in their lives, you know, and seek to live their life in accordance with the magisterium. That's a smaller fraction of that total, and a smaller fraction again of those people who are Catholic within a law firm. But you do need to have people around you who share your views, so at least you can share the problems that you're, you know.
We're communal creatures.
Yeah, and they're out there. You know, you're not alone. People might be quiet about it, but they're out there.
Refreshing sentiments. And a theme that you raise in your paper and you've raised in discussions with me is the importance of Catholics being educated, and it's only through knowing your faith that you can live your faith. And I think you made a point in your paper that there seemed to be around the 1960s where there was a big drop-off in Catholic education and a rise. I'm not sure if you actually suggested a rise in the revisionist worldview. Maybe that's me, but at least a drop-off in terms of Catholic education. To your mind, what do you think caused that sort of put us in the situation where we are today? Is that something you wouldn't mind commenting on?
Oh, I mean, there's a lot of different causes. The sexual revolution, of course, which led to the diminution in the value placed on the family and the breakdown of the traditional family and no-fault divorce, and all of those things come together to create the world that we're living in today. And then we add on to that, you know, the horrendous terror of clerical child sexual abuse. So you can see it's a perfect storm of problems. The moral integrity of the church has been attacked from its own misconduct, at the same time as society is desperately in need of that tradition and the moral foundations that ultimately are true.
I think you've made the solution to all these problems somewhat clear in your paper. A staunch focus on church magisterium, educating yourself to be a good Catholic and living a Catholic life. Michael Quinlan, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
It's been great talking to you, Tom, and hopefully we'll talk again. But in the meantime, great to talk to you, and I hope that all of the people listening to this podcast find it informative and useful.
I'm sure they will, mate. Thank you enough. I'm sure there's plenty more to talk about, so I'll keep you posted. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, Tom.